Hey guys, welcome to History with Robin. We are going to be talking about the Pony Express. And so you can see my background is a guy riding the Pony Express. And I'm sure you've already guessed that I'm dressed as someone that rode the Pony Express. Glad you guys could be here. Hi, everybody who could make it. I'm glad you're excited about learning about the Pony Express. I am too. It's a really was like a really interesting advancement in communication. I hope, Evelyn and Alette, I hope that I get less glitchy, but if I don't, just let me know. We've had some slight problems, but I think we are okay now. Great. Okay. Hello, everybody. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to share my slideshow. And we are going to start talking about the Pony Express. See, there was a great question. Oh, in your background, there's a 4C. What is that all about? Good question, Lorna. This is actually, my background is a stamp that was celebrating the Pony Express. And so the 4C, I'm assuming, is 4 cents. Hello from Pakistan, Hadia. Thank you for joining us. Okay, here we go. So we are going to be talking about the Pony Express. So what was the Pony Express and why did it start? Well, after the Oregon Trail and the Gold Rush, many settlers had come to the west coast of America. By 1860, there were over 400,000 Americans living there. And you can see on my map, the lines that are kind of have diagonal lines on them are the settled areas in 1830. And then the areas with dots are the areas that were settled between 1830 and 1860. I'm actually going to take one of my gloves off because even though I wouldn't if I were riding the Pony Express, it's kind of hard to use the mouse without it. Nice joke, Lorna. Good job. Hi, Lila. Okay, so all of those 400,000 people that were living on the west coast of America, they wanted to be able to send letters to their friends and family in their old towns, which were at least 2,000 miles away. So how could they do that? Well, why didn't they just send a text on their cell phone? Of course, that's a silly question because there was nothing like that then. Well, almost nothing like that. They did have something that was called the telegraph, which we're actually going to talk more about in my webinar tomorrow. And it was a way that you could send short messages, long distances through the wires with electricity. So why not just send your letter by telegraph? And that these men that are on the right side are stringing those telegraph lines. So because in the late 1850s, they didn't have the telegraph wires strung up in very many places. If you lived in New York, the farthest you could send a message by telegraph was the Mississippi River. So if you look at the my map to the right, if you look to my map to the right, you'll see those dark red lines are all the telegraph lines. So you could only go to a certain point. So great question, Mackenzie and Denali, you already asked the next thing I'm going to talk about. Why did they not use trains? So you might say, why not put the mail on a train? Because in 1860, at that time, though there were more railroad lines than telegraph lines, they still didn't get very far past the Mississippi River. So you can see they stretch a little bit past the Mississippi is this line that starts at Minnesota in the top, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana. But the railroads just went just a little bit past that. Good question, Lorna. How did the lines keep all the messages straight? Well, I think what would happen is they would send it through the message and it'd be a series of sounds or dashes, kind of like Morse code. And then they would be able to, they'd be able to decode it at the other side. But I am sure that that is something that they got mixed up. It's possible that from like one type of office, you could send one message. But that's a great question. So these were the railroads. So going back to the railroads, so once they did the telegraph message to as far as it could go, then they could put the letter on the railroad and get a little bit further. But back then, how did they get the mail back and forth between the eastern part to the far western part? One way was by steamship. So the good thing about a ship is that it could carry a lot of people and a lot of cargo beside the mail. The really bad thing was that it took 3 months to get to where it was going. The reason that it took so long was that they would take the ship south and they'd have to unload everything on the Isthmus of Panama between North and South America. And an isthmus is a narrow piece of land between waters. And in this case, it divides the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. So you can see, actually, maybe you can't see on that map, but you guys will, you will be able to see in my next one. It's okay, Lily, we're late. That's totally fine. We are talking about the Pony Express and the way that people would be able to get communication like letters and other things from the East Coast to the West Coast. Isis, yes, they did first use the telegraph during the wars. They would send secret messages. Kanan, I hope I said your name right. I love your telegraph. I stop, like, stop, the stop, pony, stop, express. Me too. And that's one of the things that the telegraphs would say. They would put stop in between each word. Because it would, that way, I think it helped it so that not all the words ran together. Kanan, thank you very much. I will try very hard to remember that. Okay, so here's a better picture of the Isthmus of Panama. And you can see that's the area that's outlined with the little white dots. So the boats would come down the west coast of the United States, California, and they'd get to this little area of land, and then they'd have to load everything on mules and wagons and cross that 50 miles through the jungle to the other side, to the Atlantic Ocean. Then they'd have to wait for another ship to come pick them up and load everything back up for the voyage to the north. Griffin, I see that you're raising your hand. If you have a question, just type it into the Q&A box and I will try to answer it. So while going through the Isthmus of Panama was good, it was better than having to go all the way down South America and back up the other side, it still wasn't super easy. Lorna, that's a really good question about how the messages worked on that. And I am afraid I don't have the answers for that one in this one, but I'm sure that I will have the answers for you tomorrow when we talk about the telegraph. We're going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the telegraph tomorrow. So of course, they sometimes wouldn't make it at all. So once a U.S. mail steamship called the SS South America got caught in a hurricane and went down. Besides the mail, it had 30,000 pounds of gold on it. That's a lot of gold. And in 1988, treasure hunters found the wreck at the bottom of the ocean, and they were actually able to save or salvage gold that was worth over $100 million. Oh, thank you. The SS Central America, you are right. I read that incorrectly. So while it was maybe easier, there still were dangerous things about it. Great question, Alette. Why didn't they build a railroad through the Isthmus of Panama so it didn't take so long? Because it was jungle, I'm not sure that it was a great area to build a railroad. And so it might have been just they thought it was easier to cross it. Oops. Sorry, guys. Hold on. I went a little too far. I did it again. Yes, Mackenzie and Denali, I'm sure there were men on that, people traveling on that. And Lorna, you're right. Later, they would create the Panama Canal so that it would be easier to get through that. And Mackenzie and Denali, I'm not quite sure how many people died in that, but I'm sure it was quite a bit. So another way to get the mail, so the Isthmus of Panama was one way to get the mail. That involved going, like using a boat and a wagon and donkeys and traveling the jungle and then another boat. Another way to get it back and forth across the country was stagecoach. And this would take 3 or 4 weeks during good weather. So shorter, but it would only really work during the time when there was good weather. When the mountains were full of snow, it was sometimes impossible to get a wagon through. At best, if you were in Sacramento and sent a letter to your family still living in Missouri, you might get a return letter 6 weeks later. Isha, no problem. We are talking about the Pony Express. Right now, we're talking about the things leading up to the Pony Express. They did build a canal through Panama eventually. Sydney, great question. Great question. Why could anybody ride horses to give mail to people? Yes, but they wanted to have a dependable or reliable mail thing. And Shristi, the reason they couldn't just cross America was they wanted to, but there were only certain routes where they could cross. So obviously getting 6 or 7 weeks to get a letter is not very realistic. So imagine it's 1859 and you're living in Sacramento and you're writing letters to your parents in Missouri. Dear Mom and Dad, how are you? Obviously you'd say more. 7 weeks go by. Dear Chris, fine. And you? 7 more weeks go by. Dear Mom and Dad, fine. How's the weather? 7 more weeks go by. Dear Chris, it's been cold and windy. How's the weather there? So that's kind of a funny example, but that is still would take too long. So at that time, there was a man named William Russell, and along with 2 other partners, he was running a freight wagon company. And so that meant that he was hauling things, like he got paid to haul things back and forth. Russell wanted to make more money by also hauling mail for the government. But he had the problem. How was he going to convince the government to hire him? Speed. They'd have to be faster than everybody else in express service, which means fast. But they'd never be faster than using freight wagons. So he decided, why not one rider on one horse riding fast? A pony express. And that's a picture of that man, William Russell. So they also needed a shortcut. So one way of getting the one main way of getting mail was through a route called the Butterfield Overland Mail Route. And that, you can see that's the dark blue line on my map. And that trail avoided the worst mountains, which were hard to go through. But it was 2,700 miles long. So they needed a better way. They needed a shortcut. So Russell made a decision. He was going to do a shorter version of the California Trail, which was only 1,900 miles long. So if you remember, or if you were with me for my earlier webinar in the California Trail, it was the trail that pioneers used to come to California where they didn't have to go to Oregon first. And it started in Independence, Missouri, and it went basically a lot of the same way as the Oregon Trail, but at a certain point it split off and it went south to California. So you can see it's similar, the trails. The new Pony Express Trail is on the right and the old California Trail is on the left. And it's very similar, but a little bit different. So, but there was no way that one rider on one horse could ride 1,900 miles quickly. So what they did was they built 186 stations along the trail. Each were spaced anywhere from 5 to 25 miles apart. And here is an old photo of one of those stations. Nahalia, great question. Which would I rather ride, the old California Trail or the Pony Express? I'd have to say probably the Pony Express, because I think it's faster. And it's really easy to think about riding 1,900 miles in a car, but to think about it riding it on a horse or a wagon just makes me tired thinking about it. And Mackenzie and Denali, yes, you could have 10 men on horses and go fast, but they actually came up with a better system than having many men do it. So they built these stations and they created like a relay system. Like if you guys have ever run relay races or things, one person runs, tags the next person, who runs the next bit, who tags the next person, who runs the next bit. So it was a relay system. A rider would ride fast to the next station and jump off his horse. So that would be anywhere from 5 to 25 miles. I'm assuming it would be shorter if it was like really rough ground to be riding over. Like if it was really hilly or something and the horses would get pretty tired. So he'd ride up to the next station, he'd jump off his horse. The station master, the man who ran that Pony Express station, would have a fresh horse ready for him. And the rider would switch the mail to the fresh horse, like with the bags, throw the bags on the fresh horse, jump on the new horse and ride off. In this way, he could ride 75 miles per day, which was huge at that time. Alette, I think it would be fun to ride for that long on a horse, but maybe not every day. And Lexi, yes, people learn about the Oregon Trail even if they don't live in Oregon, though I feel like because we live in Oregon, I talk about it a lot. I also really like it too. So he'd ride 75 miles a day. After 75 miles, so when his day was over and he had ridden those 75 miles, the rider would stop at a relay station, a place where he could sleep and eat. At that point, at that relay station, a fresh rider would take the mail bag and continue riding while the other guy slept. The mail bag would never stop, day or night, rain or shine, or even snow, which is really incredible to think about. And this map, I love this map that's at the bottom here, but this shows the whole route and it actually shows every station where people stopped. So as you can see, there was a lot of changing, but it was really an incredible thing that they were able to do. Hold on one guys. Good. So using that, so with that plan, Russell planned to get the mail through in 10 days. That would mean that each day he'd have to cover about 190 miles. And at first, everybody thought that was going to be impossible. But what would they need to make it work? Well, first of all, they'd need good horses. They often got these horses called Mustangs, which were these tough, wild horses, which were barely broken. So they were barely, you know, like a horse that you ride if you go horseback riding is not a wild horse. It's a horse that's either been born in a stable or on a farm and raised its whole life to be ridden by people. These Mustangs were wild horses that just lived on the plains. And so they would catch them and they would break them, or they would train them a little bit in order to be able to carry a rider and listen to the rider's commands. So Russell, when he talked about it, he said, we bought every mean bucking. That means, like, if you've ever seen a horse that's like trying to like and like throw the person off, that's bucking. Kicking horse we could find, but they could outrun everything on the trail. And they bought over 400 horses. Lorna, I have been to a rodeo. You see a lot of bucking horses there. So just as importantly, they needed lots of good, tough, courageous riders. Most were young, in their teens or early 20s. And what you can see is the left picture is a poster that was advertising for that job. And I just want to read it to you guys because it's really funny. So it says, Pony Express, St. Joseph, Missouri to California in 10 days or less. Wanted, young, skinny, wiry, meaning like strong and thin, fellows, not over 18, must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred. Wages $25 per week, which at that time was a lot of money, but it was a really dangerous job, so it makes sense that they'd be paid a lot. I just think it's funny every time I read it that they wanted orphans. So they wanted people who didn't have a family just because it was so dangerous. So on the top right of this photo of the next one is a man named Johnny Fry. And it was on April 3rd, 1860, when he became the very first rider on the Pony Express. And he went west out of St. Joseph, Missouri. So Johnny Fry was 19 that day when at 7:15 p.m., he spurred his horse, he kicked his horse, and galloped off from St. Joseph for the relay station in Kansas, carrying 50 letters in his mailbag. Only stopping for fresh horses, he rode all night for 80 miles and passed his bag to the next rider. And that mail made it to Sacramento in 10 days. What does it mean that the horses are broken, Oliver? It just means that they were wild horses, which were then trained to carry riders. You know, a wild horse just runs around and does whatever he wants and doesn't have to be ridden by anybody. So if they were broken, then they were trained just a little bit. So during his time riding for the Pony Express, Johnny Fry became famous and he was loved just like a rock star. Girls would call out to him and try to pass him special snacks when he went riding by, and all of the young boys dreamt of being a rider just like him. You're right, the poster did say age 18 or below. And I think that was maybe from a little bit of a later time, but they did want really young guys. There was another man, Robert Pony Bob Haslam, was another famous rider. He was just 20 when he made his greatest ride. He was heading east from California, carrying news of Abraham Lincoln's speech after being elected president. When he got to the relay station where he was supposed to pass his mail to the next rider, he actually found that the next rider was too scared to go on because he'd heard that there were troubles with the Native Americans up ahead. So instead of stopping, Pony Bob agreed to ride to the next station. The Pony Express almost never had troubles with the Native Americans, but in this case, Pony Bob found that it was true. The relay station had been attacked and the station master had been killed. And Pony Bob got shot with an arrow at that time, but he kept going because his mail was so important. With only one rest in 9 hours, he rode 380 miles in all, which was the furthest ride ever, but he got his mail through to the next part. So the Pony Express, it continued its service until October 1861. And that was about a year and a half of operation. During that year and a half, they delivered about 35,000 letters between people in the far west and the rest of the country. The Pony Express was like a giant leap forward in the technology of communication, almost like the internet is today. People really, really loved it. Well, I hope I understand. Okay, good. The Pony Express captured the imagination of people all over the country about the West. It was a lot of the way that the people who lived in the East ended up learning about what the West was like. And people wrote many Pony Express books, and they loved to hear the stories, even if they weren't always very true. Sometimes, you know, when you read stories, things are exaggerated a little bit. It didn't matter because they were so much fun to read. Have any of you guys ever read any books about the Pony Express? I really like, there was one, I don't have a picture of it here, but it's a really good one about the Pony Express. So you might be wondering, why did the Pony Express stop in 1861? Well, it was expensive. It cost William Russell and his company a lot of money to ride the Pony Express. They paid their riders very well. They had to have a lot of horses. They had to feed and take care of those horses. And they weren't earning enough money from delivering mail bags to keep it going. So it was very expensive. When did the Pony Express stop? It stopped in 1861. So, but remember also that we talked about the telegraph. So this is a picture that kind of tells that story. So you can see in the front part of the picture that the Pony Express guy was really fast, and he was passing by those pioneers in the wagon, which is further back in the photo. He was passing the guys putting up the telegraph lines, but at the same time, those telegraph lines are coming, they're following him. So as all of those times that the Pony Express rode out west, slowly, surely and slowly behind them, there were more and more telegraph lines being built. So they weren't necessarily needed as much. So even though the Pony Express was this huge jump forward in communication technology and the way that people could communicate with each other, it was being replaced by another huge advancement in communication technology that was coming right behind it. But during that year and a half of their service, what a special time it was for the Pony Express and for these young men who rode it. History's most important, up to that point, history's most important advancement in communication used only people and horses. So flesh and blood, and it was 1,900 miles in 10 days, rain or shine. No matter what was happening, you knew you could depend on the Pony Express rider to bring you your mail. And it came about because one man, William Russell, had this vision of a better way to deliver mail and a better way to help people be in contact with each other. And because of the courage of hundreds of young men and their fast and eager horses. It just is really, it's super remarkable. I know I have a few minutes left, but that's actually the end of my presentation. So I'm glad you guys could join me and learn a little bit more about the Pony Express. I hope you guys will join me tomorrow. We're going to be talking about the telegraph. So we're going to be talking about that next huge advancement in communication technology that came up next. I'm going to be doing, I have one more after this week that we're doing, which is the telegraph tomorrow. I'm going to be doing 2 more. So I hope you guys can join me for my last week of webinars. We're going to be talking about the Transcontinental Railroad, which was the railroad that was built so that people could travel by train from the East Coast to the West Coast. And then we're going to be talking about cowboys and cattle drives, which should be really fun. So I really hope that I can see you guys then, and I hope you enjoyed this and that you learned a lot. And I'll see you guys tomorrow, okay? I hope you have a great day. Bye.